The show focused on delivering beneficial information on everything to do with products and services that can improve your life. This is Experts on Call on AM 650.
Welcome back to the show. It's Key Pacific's Talk About Strata. Sterling Fox, your host, joined in studio by Tony Gioventu, the Executive Director of the Condominium Homeowners Association of British Columbia. Mr. Gioventu is also the Condo Smarts columnist for the Vancouver province. We have perhaps one of the longest email addresses in the world, Tony, but let's give it again because, by gosh, people actually write it down and send us notes. It's Talk About Strata at Quay Pacific, and this is a tricky part. Quay is Quay Pacific.com. I'll give it to you again. Talk About Strata at Quay Pacific.com. Karen in Gibson's up there on the Sunshine Coast made it through to our mailbox, and she wrote an interesting inquiry, Tony. She bought a unit with 2 skylights in it recently, in need of some repair. Now, she approached the Strata Council in the building that she just bought into, and they said, well, those are your responsibility, Karen, because they were not part of the original building design. She says, the skylights, hey, wait a second, this is common property here, and wants to know, Tony, who's right?
Complicated question.
Certainly
and a complicated problem.
And Tony, I should mention, friends, is not a judge.
Yeah, it's a complicated problem because you're dealing with a series of issues, and I think this is actually a very common issue that many people in strata corporations deal with. People historically may get permission from the Strata Council to do things like enclose their balconies, put a skylight on, change a window or install a new window, or make changes to the common property. You may or may not find those in the minutes of the meetings. They could have been done 10 years ago, for example. Or in her case, it sounds like they're older skylights, maybe even 15 years ago.
Okay.
Right? And so since they were done, we may have had 2, 3, 4, 5 subsequent owners. And so there would have been no way of that information in any kind of corporate memory passing on from owner to owner. The legislation gives some very clear provisions of how this is done, but it also relies upon the fact that a strata corporation is really going to have maintained records and documents to be able to disclose this information, and maybe even have some agreements to say to the next buyer, oh, by the way, there is an agreement that you're going to be responsible for those skylights. That's rare. I'd like to say that it was common, but that's rare.
Would the previous owner, sorry to interrupt, but would the previous owner, the person that sold Karen the unit with these 2 questionable skylights in it, would that individual have been legally required to say, I put those in, they weren't part of the original design?
Well, it would certainly be a question that Karen would have wanted to have asked.
Okay.
Were there any improvements or betterments that were not part of the original building? That would be a question that a buyer would ask when you're going through the process, because there are certainly there are going to be betterments as well. I bet that the skylights are probably only one of several things. There are probably new kitchen cabinets. The kitchen's probably been updated. There are probably new hardwood flooring in the unit. And so there have probably been upgrades done to the unit over the years, none of which are the responsibility of the strata to either maintain or to ensure. But here we come to the problem of maintenance. Who's really going to maintain these skylights?
Yeah.
Right? And this is the problem is, are they still common property? Yes. The strata plan's not been changed. They're still common property. So
Karen is, at least in that sense, technically right.
She's partially right, but they're also a betterment. These are not things that were part of the original property of the Strata Corporation.
Okay. So the Strata Council is kind of technically right, too.
Well, everybody's kind of right in this situation.
Okay, all right.
And historically, she may have asked for a Form B, which is an information certificate that tells her things about the strata before she bought.
Okay.
And if she did that, and if there were any agreements around maintenance and repair of these skylights, those agreements would have been attached to that form, or should have been attached to that form. And that's a level of disclosing information to a buyer about, by the way, you're going to be responsible for the cost of these skylights. Now, it's interesting thing is that the Act doesn't allow a strata corporation to make an owner responsible to maintain and repair common property, only for the cost of maintenance of common property alteration if permission has been given, right?
Oh, okay.
And so it's a technical kind of sequence that's very difficult for strata corporations to process in order. So the strata gives permission to the skylights, They get a document signed that, yes, I'll be responsible for cost, but the maintenance and repair of the skylight is still going to be the responsibility of the Strata Corporation because it's still common property.
Even though the bill will get eventually sent to the person in that unit with the 2 skylights.
The bill could eventually get sent to that person with the 2 skylights,
right.
Absolutely. And the alternative is if the person says, I'm not going to pay for it, well, they're betterments and it's common property, so the Strata Council is going to say, if you don't agree to pay for it, we're simply going to have the skylights removed and we're going to put the original roofing back in place. And that will be the decision of the corporation because this, while this is a betterment or an alteration, it still is not one of those original assets that the Strata Corporation had to either maintain or repair or even insure for in some capacity. But it doesn't change the fact that it's still common property. And that's one of the things that's very difficult for strata corporations and owners to realize. And most of these alterations, when you move in, you buy in, you're a subsequent owner, you look at the history of ownership, there have been 5 owners. If nothing's been disclosed, who knows what owner installed that?
Right.
That's a problem. And, in a recent file that I looked at where we were working with the Strata said to the owner who seemed to have this really deluxe unit, well, look, you have hardwood flooring and you have granite countertops and you have skylights and, those are not part of the original construction. We're not insuring for it, and you're going to be responsible for the costs that are associated with maintenance and repair. But when we looked closely at it, it turned out it was part of the original because in every development, you almost find a show suite that was put in by the developer,
Of course, yes. The nicest suite in the building, usually.
That show suite installed by the owner-developer is part of the original construction.
Of course it would be,
right?
yeah.
Part of the common assets, and it is the responsibility of the Strata to maintain and repair those common property elements, insure for all of those common assets. So, the maintenance and repair obligation around these alterations, it's a complicated problem. No 2 strata corporations have dealt with it exactly the same. The best thing that a strata corporation can do is to create an inventory of all of these alterations and then address them one at a time as how they're going to deal with their future repairs and who's going to pay for those costs.
Okay, so now back to Karen's email there from the Sunshine Coast. She just flat out was kind of caught. She figures that those 2 skylights, which definitely need some work, are part of the building.
Yes.
The condo Strata Council says, no, they're not part of the original building. Some owner put them in as an improvement, a betterment, as you say. So how's this one going to shake out? You've seen thousands of these conflicts in the past. You're not a judge, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but what's the likely outcome of something like this based on your experience?
Well, I think part of the problem is the miscommunication of language. Karen's assumption is that the Strata Corporation is going to maintain and repair them. And I think that for the Strata Corporation's interest, and also because the requirements of the legislation, they should be the ones who maintain and repair them because they want to control how this maintenance is done.
Sure.
If it's not done properly, they're just going to end up with a greater mess with roofing problems and damages and probably insurance claims. So they want to do it. What the real issue is, who's going to pay for this? Right? That's what it comes down to. And if it's a betterment and this betterment or this alteration is something that the owner of the strata lot is not prepared to pay for, then the Strata Corporation is probably going to be in a position to make a decision. Are we going to maintain them, or are we simply going to remove them and restore it back to the original construction?
Now, what if it gets a little acrimonious and Karen says, okay, to heck with you people. I'm going to go out and find a qualified repairman, and I'm going to get those windows, those skylights fixed to my satisfaction. Winter's coming, and I don't want to deal with it anymore. I want it done soon. She goes out, finds the right repair person who comes in, does a terrific job, gives her the bill, Bob's your uncle, it's all over. Now, Karen's sitting with this bill that she's paid for maybe a few $100, maybe more. Is she still going to want to trot that bill down to the next Strata Council meeting?
Well, if Karen arranges for those repairs herself, she's paying for those repairs herself.
All right.
Generally,
once you assume that, if you're on the hook for it.
If you do not have the consent of the Strata Corporation to proceed with an expense on their behalf, and I'd say written consent to be able to do that, and that's pretty rarely given. But if you don't have that consent, you're going to have a very difficult time collecting that because the Strata didn't consent to paying for it in the first place.
Sure.
Right? And it's likely not part of the original construction. It's a betterment. It's something that affects only and benefits only your strata lot. So it's quite likely within your expectation to pay for the repair and maintenance. But alterations like skylights, rooftop decks, balcony enclosures. Strata corporations need to pay close attention to those details, because if they're not dealt with properly, they can do an enormous amount of damage over a long period of time to a building system.
Tony, let me stop you for just a second, because in the course of dealing with Karen's email, and Karen, thanks, so by the way, for sharing your quandary with us. We do appreciate it. You've mentioned the Act and the legislation a couple of times. What are you talking about? What specific act or legislation governs strata in British Columbia?
The Strata Property Act, the regulations, and the Schedule of Standard Bylaws under the Strata Property Act is the legislation that governs the business of strata corporations.
Okay.
Right? The Schedule of Standard Bylaws is where you're going to find all of the basic, it's kind of like the assembly instructions, all of the basic regulations around the roles and responsibility of maintenance and repair. The Act is fairly explicit on the common elements. Strata is responsible to maintain and repair common property. Owners are responsible to maintain and repair their strata lots. But the Act, the Schedule of Standard Bylaws are the default set of bylaws that everybody starts with in a strata, regardless of the type of strata.
So everybody plays on the same field.
Everybody starts with those. Those can be amended, however. And you can even see bylaws amended for collective use. Even in some bare land stratas where the strata is not responsible to maintain and repair buildings, where we have retirement communities, just for quantity of scale and the benefits of cost, the strata through their bylaws may have adopted regular maintenance of roofing systems and gutters to make sure that they're done on a routine basis. And the long-term benefit is, of course, it costs much less to have a singular contract for 50 homes than 50 separate contracts. So the strata corporations can alter their bylaws with respect to maintenance and repairs. The thing they have to remember is they cannot make an owner responsible to maintain and repair common property. The maintenance and repair of common property is the responsibility of the strata. And here's a quirky little thing around legislation. It says a strata may not make a person responsible to maintain and repair common property unless permitted by the regulations. Well, the regulations themselves don't permit it. So you know by default that the strata corporation must maintain and repair the common property.
Okay. All right, interesting stuff. Tony Gioventu from the Vancouver Province, the Condo Smarts column every Sunday, is also the Executive Director of the Condominium Homeowners Association of BC. I'm Sterling Fox. This is Key Pacific's Talk About Strata. We'll be right back.
There's still more ahead with Experts on Call, the show focused on delivering relevant and beneficial consumer information. This is Experts on Call on AM 650.